Hello learners, welcome to another session on statistics in psychology. In this session we are going to talk about a very important topic which is called measures of variability. Before going to the topic, let me discuss what we have done so far. So in this session basically we have to deal another kind of descriptive measures. Although in the descriptive statistics basically we discuss about the three things, like one is called statistics of location, the second one is called statistics of dispersion, and the third one is called statistics of correlation. In statistics of location, we have already discussed in the previous sessions related with the mean median mode, computation of mean median mode, concept of mean median mode, and all the things related with that. In this session basically we are going to deal with the another kind of descriptive statistics which is called statistics of dispersion. So as we know that in the statistics of location we had a discussion on mean median mode, which has a significance to understand the data at one level. So the measures like give mean usually gives us average, a set of observation of data through which we get average score, and mean basically gives us one representative of the data set. However, the average cannot be a true representative of data because of the variation in the distribution is also there. So you know that in some of the data set when you go through, you will see that over there that the data has a good kind of variations. All data, some data are similar in nature, but some are different from each other. So although by looking mean score only, we cannot even predict or we cannot identify the nature of data in a very true sense. So although the mean is or we can say the central tendency is also a kind of through which we can understand one representative of the data set, but it is not truly representation of the data because each data vary from one another. So therefore we need to understand here another concept which is called measure of variability. The word itself understand very explainable that variability means how the data vary from each other, and we will discuss more how we calculate the variability and what are the significance of variability, and in other words how do we calculate the dispersion and all. We will discuss more about it in just further discussion. Before going to these discussions, let me give you one example that through which you can understand what we are going to discuss. Suppose there are two data sets. As you can see in the screen, there is a data set A and data set B. In these two data set, there are 10 numbers, means n is equal to 10, and their total score is also 60 for both the data set, and mean is also remains same for data set A and data set B, which is 6. But as you can see that when we say that the data set A has a 6 mean and data set B has a 6 mean, in one extent we can say both the data set are similar. But as far as the individual data is concerned, you can see that data set A has more different number of data which vary more from the mean score, which is 6. As far as the data B is concerned, it is more nearby the mean score data, which is called which is actually 6, and the data, all the data in the data set B are nearby the mean score 6. So as can be seen in this example that the mean is the same for the data A and data B, but the data vary in terms of their deviations from the mean. And this can be the important topic through which you can understand the whatever the mean we have seen so far is one of the representative of the data, but through which we cannot understand it's a true representative or not. In both the data set that we have just given you example, in which you can see that both data set has the same mean, but the variability is different in both the data set. So it is very important to consider the variation in the data or set of observation to understand more about the data set. So let's talk more about the concept of variability in data. So in this session basically we will be explaining the concept of variability, which is also known as dispersion in data. So dispersion actually refers to the variations that exist within and amongst the score obtained by a group. So in dispersion we try and see how each score in a group vary from the mean or the average score. You know that mean is somehow also we say as an average score. So the larger the dispersion means less is the homogeneity. Means larger the dispersion explains that each data is vary from the mean differently and the variation from the mean is larger, which indicates that there is a less homogeneity of the group concerned. And if the dispersion is less, it means that the group is more homogeneous in nature. So dispersion is an important statistics which help us to know how far the sample population vary from Newer's population. So variability in statistics means deviation of a score in a group or series from their mean scores. It is actually refers to the spread of a score in a group in relation to the mean. So the mean is the center, but each score, how much it is far away from the mean, it is also very important to know. The reason only that when we say represent a set of data with the help of mean, we usually say this is the representation of the data. But as you have seen in the previous example, that only by looking the mean score, we can't explain truly about all the data. Maybe some data are very near to the mean score, some are very far away from the mean score, which is not explaining truly about the data. Although in both the data set we have seen that the mean score was same, but the nature of data were different. So it is also very important to know. So in some of the manner we are going to discuss more about variability, and which is also known as dispersion. And we will also try to understand how do we compute a dispersion of any data set in the further discussion. For instance, in a group of 10 participants who have a score differently on one of the tests, maybe you can say like mathematics test, in each individual vary from the other in terms of their marks, and whatever the marks he or she has scored, they are vary from each other. So these variation can be measured with the help of measure of variability, and the measure of dispersion of different values of the average values or average score can be considered as a measure of variability. So variability or dispersions also means that a scatter of the value in the group, how much the values are scattered in the group, which can be measured through the measures of variability or dispersion. So high variability in the distribution means the score are widely spread and are not homogeneous in nature. So if the variability score is high, it means the distribution of a score within the group is a very spread, and the data is spread, and which can also be understood as the data is not homogeneous in nature. Low variability means that the score are similar and homogeneous in nature, and they are concentrated in the middle or in the center, we can say. So according to the Minium, King and Beer in 2001, measures of variability express quantitatively to extent to which the score in a distribution are scattered around or cluster together. So this is the at what extent they are similar to each other, or at what extent they are scattered around the mean. So they describe the spread of an entire set of a score. They do not specify how far a particular score diverges from the center of this group. So it basically describe the measures of the dispersion or variability, basically describe how much the data is spread and which is far from the mean. So these measures of variability do not provide information about the shape of distribution or the level of performance of the group. So it is not actually the score through which we can understand the shape of the score, although it explains that how much data is homogeneous or spread in that particular data set. So measure of variability fall under the descriptive statistics that describe how similar a set of a score are to each other. Means if the set of data, we have 10 set of data and we calculated mean is 6, then we can assume that if the variability is low, it means most of the data are similar to the mean score 6. If the variability is high, it means we can assume that the maximum number of data are away from the mean score, which is 6. So the greater the similarity of the score to each other, lower would be the measures of variability or dispersion we interchangeably use the word variability or dispersion. Both has the same meaning. The less of similarity of the scores are to each other, higher will be the measure of variability of dispersion. So in this sense, you can understand what actually measures of variability explains. So in general, more the spread of distribution, larger will be the measure of dispersion. So to state in a very simplest way, we can say that the variation between the data value in a sample is called dispersion. So I am repeating once again, the variation between the data value in the sample is called dispersion. The most commonly used measure of dispersion are range, standard deviation, average deviation, and quartile deviation. All these are the very common and we use in statistics in a frequent manner. Especially in the psychology, stream of psychology. So let me go to the examples through which you can understand more about these things, and we will discuss all these measures of variability as I discussed that range, it can be quartile deviation, it can be variable average deviation, then we have a standard deviation, then variance. All these things we will discuss in further discussion. So let me give you one example through which you can understand more about the data. So the marks obtained by the student of a group A and group B in the test are as follows, as you can see in the screens. So marks of a group A is 5, 4, 38 and so on, and there are total number of students were 10 in a group A, and similarly in a group B we have a 10 students. So total score was 200 for the group A and similarly for group B, and the mean score was 20 and 20. So in these two data set, you can see that what actually comes first things in your mind. As far as the mean score is concerned, you can say both data set are similar, but when you go and see the individual data in each data set, you will see that although the mean score are remain same in both the group, but each individual score are vary from each other, vary in the different level. And you can see that moreover in the data set B, most of the data are nearby the mean score 20, but in the data set A, it is too far away. And how do we know about it? Let me discuss more about it in the detail. So as a first glance, you can say as far as the mean as concerned, both the data set have a same representation, but as far as the variability is concerned, you can see that there are different variation among the data set within their data group. So the mean score of the both is definitely is 20. As far as the mean goes, there is no difference for the performance of the two groups, but there is a difference in performance of the two groups in terms of how each individual students vary in marks from each other. So you can see in the data set once again, and you can relate that although the mean score are same, but the individual data differ from each other. So for instance, the test score of group A are found a range. So here I would like to introduce you a term which is called range, which is common in our day-to-day conversation, through which we can, at one extent, we can say that how much variability is there. Very initial stage of the data set, we can say initially we can say that whether the dispersion or variability is there in the data, at what extent it is there, we can calculate with the help of range. And range is nothing but it is a subtraction of higher score minus minimum score. So maximum score minus minimum score, when we subtract maximum score minus to minimum score, we get range of the data set. So in this data set that we have discussed, just shown you group A and group B, in which we had a mean 20, you can see that group A are found to a range of 5 to 38, means the minimum score of the group A is 5, although at the maximum score is 38. Whereas in the second group B, we can see that the minimum score is 18 and the maximum score is 23. So it means that some of the students of a group A are doing very well and some are doing very poorly, and the performance of some of the students is falling in the average level. So on other hand, the performance of all the students of the second group is falling within nearby the average mean scores. As you can see in the slide, in the group A, we have a range from 5 to 38, or minimum score was 5, whereas the maximum score was 38. But in the group B, we have minimum score 18 and a maximum score 23. So accordingly, you can understand in the group A, some students extremely well perform, because their score is 38, which is too far from the mean, which is 20, and some poorly perform, and you can see the minimum score was 5. So accordingly, in the second group, 18 and 23 are the minimum and maximum score respectively, but both the score are somehow near to the mean score, which is 20. So with this you can understand, in the second group, students is falling within the near about the average, which is mean score is 20. It is evident from this example that the measures of central tendency provide us incomplete picture of the set of the data. It gives insufficient base of the comparison of the two or more set of score, because as far as the mean score is concerned, both the data set had a same score, but which actually does not gives us a proper picture about the data. Whereas when we go and see the dispersion or deviation or variability within the data set, we can see some different picture about the data. Thus, in addition to the measure of central tendency, we need an index of how the scores are scattered around the center of the distribution. In other words, we can say we need a measure of dispersion or variability to know more about the data set. So measure of central tendency is a summary of a score, and the measure of dispersion is a summary of the spread of a score. So this is somehow you can relate with the previous discussion. So in the previously we had discussed about the central tendency. The central tendency is the summary of a score only, whereas the measure of dispersion or variability is a summary of spread of a score, how scores are spread within the group. Information about the variability is often and important as that about the central tendency. So we can't ignore the term central tendency, but we can understand that the central tendency is equally important to understand the variability, because further analysis or further calculation take place with the help of central tendency only. So information about the variability is often important that about the central tendency, as we have seen in the previous discussion. So the term variability is or dispersion is also known as the average of the second degree, because here we consider the arithmetic mean of the deviation from the mean of the value of the individual item. Therefore, we also say is a dispersion is also known as the average of the second degree, because in the first degree we calculate the average of the score, and we see that how this average of the score actually how individual score is different from this average of the score. So this is also, in other words, we also known as, this person is also known as average of the second degree. To describe a distribution adequately, therefore, we usually must provide a measure of central tendency and measure of variability. There are two things that which are very common, and you will realize in the further discussions when you go and see that how these things are really important to understand the nature of the data. And accordingly, we go further for the analysis which comes under the inferential statistics. So in the descriptive statistics, basically we discuss three things: measures of location, measure of dispersion, and measures of correlation. So we are discussing in that this point, which is called measures of dispersion. So measures of variability are also very important in the statistical inferences when we go for the drawing inferences. So with the help of measure of dispersion, we can know about the fluctuation of random sampling and how much fluctuation will occur in the random sampling. So these things can also be understood with the help of measure of dispersion. So when you draw a sample from the population, every time you will see you will have a different kind of data set, and every time you will have a different kind of variability. So the kind of sampling that you are using can also be reflected in terms of the variability. This question is a fundamental to every problem in the statistics inferences. It is a question about the variability, that which type of sampling you have used. So as far as the importance of the variability, let us discuss more about it. What is the importance of this variability? Although you have a certain kind of understanding so far, but let me explain more about it, that where we can say that the variability has a certain importance. So measure of variabilities are used to test the extent to which an average represents in the characteristics of the data. If the variation is small, then it indicates that a high uniformity of the value in the distribution, and average represents that the characteristics of the data. On the other hand, we can say that if the variation is large, then it indicates the lower degree of uniformity and the unreliable average is there. So by looking only the mean score, we can't predict more about the data set. So when we go and see the variability, we can make whether the average is reliable or not very reliable. If the variability is low, then we can say the mean score is more reliable as compared to the where we have a more variability. So measure of variability help us to identify the nature and the cause of variation. Such information can be used to control the variation. Of course, when we know about the variation, definitely we will try to control more about those variation if it is there in the data set. So measure of variability also help us in the comparison of the spread in the two or more set of the data with respect to their uniformity or consistency, whether the two data set is uniform or they are consistent or they are similar. We can also not only help with the average score or mean score or central tendency, we can also go for the measures of variability. So measures of variability basically facilitate the use of a statistical technique such as correlation, regression analysis and so on. You will be more aware about it in the further discussions. So as far as the functions of variability, we can say that it is used the calculation other statistics such as analysis of variance, degree of correlation, regression, etc. It is also used to comparing the variability in the data obtained as the case of socio-economic status, income, education, where you can easily calculate the variability, and it has a function where when we want to know that the socio-economic status of the particular group of the society, whether the variation is high or low, we can easily identify with the variability. So income, suppose you have to identify the income of the particular group, you can get average score, but the average score does not give us a proper, accurate, significant meaning of that data group. So with the help of variability, you can understand within the group, if the income variability is high, it means that there are variation in the person's income within the group. Similarly, you can see in the education, any other context, you can calculate the variability to know more about the group or data set. To find out the average or the mean, median, mode, workout is reliable. If the variation is small, then we could state that the average calculated is reliable. But if the variation is too large, then the average may be not that much reliable, and we can say it is not that much reliable because of it is not a best representative of the data. Because the variation is higher, it means that whatever the representation score we are reflecting in terms of the mean is vary from the each score. So dispersions gives us an idea about the variability is adversely affecting the data and thus help us in controlling the variability. So dispersions gives an idea of the variability is adversely affecting the data, means in other way it help us to controlling the variability. So there are another concept that you need to know here, which is called absolute dispersion and relative dispersion, or absolute variability or relative variability. So in your course of study, you are only going to deal with the absolute dispersion. What absolute dispersion is actually all about? So absolute measure of dispersion is used to compare the two different data set if they are in the same unit. Means you can compare the weight with the weight, not with the height. So if the two data set has the same unit, you can compare, you can calculate the measures of dispersion, and you can compare whether which data set has a more variability. And if we have a same unit of the two data set, we calculate absolute measure of dispersion. Whereas the relative measure of dispersion is used to compare the two different data set if they are in different in units. So whatever the measures of dispersions we are going to discuss and calculate or compute, which is called range, which we have already discussed, range, then we have a quartile deviation, then we have average deviation, then we have a standard deviation and variation. All these comes under the absolute measure of dispersion, because this can be computed when we have a two or more group which has a same unit. So relative measure of dispersion is not a part of your study, so you may get awareness about this kind of dispersion with your own study with the different textbook which is available. So when we talk about the types of measure of dispersions or variability, we have, as I told you, that we have four which we are going to discuss, which is called range, quartile deviation, average deviation, or which is also known as mean deviation, then we have a standard deviation or variance. As far as the range is concerned, let me discuss more about the range, although we have briefly introduced in the just before discussion. Range can be defined as the difference between the highest and lowest score in the distribution. This is calculated by the subtracting the lowest score from the highest scores of the distribution. This is a kind of equation where you can say range is equal to highest score minus lowest score. So the range is a rough measure of dispersions because it tells about the spread of extreme score, not to spread of any of the scores in between. So it gives us a very superficial kind of dispersion, whether we can at one extent we can understand whether if the range is high, it means that there are two extreme scores which is there. For instance, the range of the distribution, like if we have a data set like 4, 10, 12, 20, 25, 50 will be the range you may calculate on your own. The maximum score is 50 and minimum score is 4, then the range would be 50 minus 4 is equal to 46. Let me come to the discussion where we can say that what are the merits of this range. And when we talk about the merits of the range, we can say it is a very easy to compute. As you can see that only you have to subtract maximum score minus minimum score. When we compare to the two measures of variability and when you compare other measures of variability, you will see that the range is a very simplest way of calculation. The range is ideal for primary initial work, or you can say other circumstances where the precision is not that much requirement or that much required, where you can at the initial stage the range can be calculated. It is quite useful in case of where the purpose is only to find out the extent of extreme variations such as temperature, rainfall. We generally you see when you go and see the forecast of any locality, you definitely encounter with the two score, the minimum temperature of the day and the maximum temperature of the day. Basically, this helps us to understand the range of the temperature. Accordingly, rainfall is also one of the examples through which you can get the range score. So range is effectively used in the application of test of significance with the small sample, where we have a very small sample. Although it has certain limitations as far as the calculation of range is based on only two extreme score value in the data set and does not consider the other value of the data set. It is a kind of limitation. By considering only two, which is two data of the data set, which is one is the maximum score and one is the minimum score, it does not cover other data set which has a significance to understand the variability. So this is one of the kind of limitations you can understand here in the as far as the range limitation is concerned. So value is very sensitive to the change in the sampling. Of course, its value is influenced by the large sample. Range cannot be used for the open-ended class interval, because when we use the open-ended class interval where one int can be open, either you cannot get a minimum score or maybe you cannot get a maximum score. On that condition you can't calculate the range score, because for the calculation of range score you must have minimum score or maximum score of the distribution. So this is another kind of limitations you can say. Further, the mathematical calculation are not possible with the help of range. So therefore we have another kind of measures of variability. We will discuss more about it in the further discussion. So as far as the another limitation is concerned, the range indicates two extreme score. Thus the magnitude or the frequency of the intermediate score is somehow missing in the calculation. It does not indicate the form of distribution like skewedness, kurtosis, model of distribution of the score. It does not reflect with their calculations, or we can say the skewedness cannot be explained with the help of range. A single extreme score may also be increased the range disappropriately, or we can say disappropriately. It can be also proportionate, can be increased in some of the sense. We can say the single extreme score may also increase the range. Means if the one extreme score, there are only two extreme scores in the data set and rest of the data set are nearby the mean. So these two extreme score can change the range, although the most of the data can be uniform in nature. So this is the one of the another limitation that we can say as far as the range is concerned. Let me discuss more about the use of range. In the use of range, we can say the range is applied in the diverse area as we have already somehow discussed, and the range is used to area where there are small fluctuation, such as stock market rate of exchange, some of the area which usually very significance of the range. So range may be used in the day-to-day activity like daily sales in a grocery store or any monthly wages in the factory, etc., where you can see that how the daily activities take place and how much daily sales take place, or somehow in other psychological parameters where you can say if the individual mood is fluctuating, then we can measure in the some different time and we can get the range of the scores where we can predict where the fluctuation is high or low. Range is also used in the weather forecast that we have already discussed, like the variation of the temperature in the day. When the researcher is only interested to know about the extreme score or the total spread of the score, range is most beautiful measures, or you can say useful measures of variability. Range can also be used when the data are too scattered, or we can say justify the use of most appropriate measure of variability where the data is more scattered. So the range in somehow initial measures of variability where we do not have opportunity to go in detail about the data, and in the calculation of range we only use the two scores, which is one is minimum and the one is maximum score. We do not consider the rest of the scores which must be considered to know more about the variability, and for that we have another kind of variability, measures of variability. We will discuss more about this in the further sessions. So as far as this session is concerned, what we have discussed so far, we have discussed what is called measures of variability and what is called measures of dispersion, and we have seen that the measures of dispersion and variability has a significant to understand more about the data. And in this regard we have seen that measures of variability is equally important as far as the measures of central tendency. So in the descriptive statistics, basically we discuss three things. One is called measures of central tendency, then measures of variability, and measures of correlation. So in this session we talked about one measures of variability, which is called range. In upcoming sessions we will discuss more about quartile deviation, then average deviation, then we have a standard deviation, and a little bit about variance. So with this we are the end of this session. I hope that you have understand all this concept, and I would request you to go through once again the entire video and see whether the concept is clearly understood by you or not, and accordingly you may go for the practice. Thank you so much for your patience. Have a nice day.